we're all guilty of this, by the way. Every single person watching this video right now is guilty of practicing racism in some form or another. That could be that you've had a racist thought that never resulted in action or words. It could be that you've said racist things. It could be that you've done racist things. So we really just need to broaden that definition and start to understand the ways in which we participate in this damaging system. The other thing that they want us to understand is that the definition of racism historically has been linked to this connection between prejudice and power. And often social scientists, but also lay people would say that there's kind of like two camps. One camp is that everybody can experience racism, including white people, which, by the way, as a white person, I'm here to tell you is complete bullshit. Okay. White people cannot experience racism. Just gonna toss that out there. And then the other camp is that white people can't experience racism, and it's only white people, because they have power, who practice racism against people of color. And both of those things, both of those perspectives, that whites can experience racism because everybody does, and that whites can't experience racism and it's only whites against marginalized populations that practice racism, are false. And so Ami and Wanat want us to understand that racism can be practiced by anybody, and that it is about the marginalization of an individual who is lower than you on the hierarchy. And this is why whites can't experience racism, because they are at the top of the race hierarchy. Okay? In every social situation, every single social institution, every social interaction that exists, whites have power. I don't care. It doesn't matter the situation, whites have power. So whites cannot experience racism because they're at the top. But that doesn't mean that they're the only ones who can practice racism, because again, you have a hierarchy, and if you go through, and I could ask you, or I could say, tell me what that hierarchy looks like, you probably know. And you know this because it's seeping in our culture, right? The next group in the hierarchy are Asians, and in particular East Asians, right? This particular racial group has been labeled the model minority because they act white, right? That's what that means. And so you can have somebody in the model minority category as someone who is of Chinese descent, for example, discriminating and stereotyping somebody who's black, and that's racism. Why? Because they have more power than black people in society. So it's not just whites who practice prejudice and power and therefore racism. It can be any racial group practicing it against a further marginalized group below them. And there's no such thing as reverse racism. So if you flip that coin, it doesn't work. Okay, that doesn't exist. It's not a thing. Xenophobia manifests itself in several ways. First, there's this fear around losing one's identity. We see this a lot amongst white male Americans, that they fear that America is evolving, that immigrants are taking over, and that they're losing their sense of identity. This isn't true. The United States has always been a nation of immigrants. But it doesn't matter that that's not true, because the fear is very real for them. And that fear is going to drive behavior, and in particular harmful behaviors that we see in society. For example, oftentimes white working class men will blame immigrants for taking their jobs, despite the fact that there's not evidence that that's actually what's happening. But they scapegoat them. I've lost my job. I'm unemployed. I make low wages. My life is low and miserable. So I'm going to look for someone to blame. I'm blaming the immigrant, and that's scapegoating. The reason why this says performance of belonging is because for people of color, it often feels like a performance in order to fit in with white society. Again, it's not something they would maybe default to or naturally feel inclined to participate in, but they recognize the importance of those activities in order to feel like they fit in with the white community. Institutions are really important to the culture of belonging. It's really important to that process an individual goes through in order to feel like they're a part of the community. There are policies in place that are exclusionary. There are institutions that are white-dominated or support white supremacy ideologies. And those types of institutions and policies are constraining. It's going to make people of color feel as though they're outsiders, even if they are American-born. One of the goals of sociology is to reveal how these structures can be constraining and then try to encourage structural change at the institutional level so that they can be more enabling. How can an institution help people of color to feel included? or as if they belong in the community? How can we reflect policy that's inclusive? Ultimately, with the culture of belonging, people want to feel as if they're home. I think the reading refers to it as feeling like they can kick their feet up on the coffee table. They want that sense that it's comfortable, that it's safe, and that they are a real member of the community. And with Asian Americans in rural America, this is a struggle because they're always seen as outsiders or exotic, even their children who were born in the community. Frequently, I hear this in more conservative circles, this concept of like, if you come to America and you want to be a part of the community, you should learn English. And I think that's a very ethnocentric position, that English is the best, English is ideal, everyone should speak it. Again, we all can participate in inclusionary practices, and the question becomes, well, should we be learning multiple languages? Should, for example, students in K through 12 learn Spanish or learn Chinese? And these are questions at the institutional level, right, that we should be considering. Certainly anybody within their own household has the ability to teach their children multiple languages. But the fact that there's such a huge pressure on people to know English and to know English well acts to exclude people who don't speak English. Perfect English. And when I say perfect English, I mean, do you sound white? Because there's lots of ways to speak English, but the most valued way is the white way. Think of phenotype as those physical characteristics, things like eye color, eye shape, hair texture, hair color, skin color, nose shape, body size, body shape, all these different physical things that we look at in somebody to determine whether or not they're a part of a particular racial group. Again, these are social constructions. You can't actually trace those body types to a specific race, but they're the ones we use to other people. One woman actually described almost feeling like a zoo animal, that her patient brought his daughter in because his daughter had never seen somebody from India before. They felt almost as if they were on display as this interesting foreign thing for the local community of whites to come in and observe and experience as something to, see for the first time or be very curious about. And while curiosity, I think, is understandable, you have to consider how very homogenous these rural communities are in terms of race. So it's probably highly likely that some of them have literally never seen somebody from Asia before. But at the same time, that's kind of a failing of our culture, that we don't welcome diversity into rural areas, or that we don't express diversity in institutions like media. We don't talk about diversity in the institutions of education in these communities. And so when they actually come across a person who looks different than them, they respond with that level of curiosity and I think unintentional ignorance. So I think a part of sociology is trying to better understand the experience of people of color while also recognizing the structural conditions that make this predictable from white people, from the white community. And so then how do we change this dynamic? How do we change that process so that a person who's Asian can live in rural America and not feel like they're exotic? Right? Make them feel they're home. This is their community. Why should they be made to feel as if they're a foreigner or an outsider? So phenotype played a huge role in them feeling as if they didn't belong. They also noted that some of their cultural practices, their ethnic practices, also made them feel like outsiders, that they were compelled to participate in the cultural practices of whites in the community, things like Christmas celebrations, putting a tree up, eating turkey at Thanksgiving, mostly because they didn't want their kids to feel weird at school. They wanted their children to fit in with the white culture or white ethnic practices. Again, if we had a society that was more inclusive, we tend to talk about the United States as being a melting pot, as if that's ideal. Ideally, we would shoot for a salad bowl, that we can bring in different people practicing different cultural rituals and having different ethnic traditions where they're allowed to keep those while still being widely accepted. And what we have now is if you come here, you melt into the white culture, you melt into white heritage, even if that's not who you are, even if that's not who you want to be. So a lot of times these individuals feel compelled to assimilate, to adopt cultural practices that are not theirs, that they aren't even really interested in, but they do it because they want to fit in. They want to be a part of that community. And then make this even more macro when you look at something like xenophobic politics, the way that the alt-right is starting to dominate politics, the way that conservative Republicans, and I mean ultra-conservative Republicans, reflect these xenophobic ideologies. They use language in mainstream media. They're writing legislation that's incredibly harmful towards immigrants and also towards anybody who is foreign appearing, right, based on those phenotypes. They're really instilling fear in everyday people, and in particular everyday white people, that anybody who looks foreign is dangerous. That, of course, is going to make somebody who looks foreign, even if they're American born, feel uneasy in their own community. They're seeing hate verbiage used. They're witnessing hate politics. They're experiencing hate crimes themselves. And this can make you feel like you, one, don't want to go out, which is going to really prohibit community building, but also that if you go out, you're always at risk, which is going to make you really anxious in trying to interact with people in your own community. In rural America, there's not that large of a population of any one ethnicity to really segregate off and create these enclaves. So instead, they come together and form a huge multi-ethnic community of people from lots of different ethnicities and racial and cultural backgrounds. Instead of forming something like all Chinese people in one area of the city, it's Chinese people with Indian people, with Pacific Islanders, all coming together in a part of the city in order to build community. And they find camaraderie with each other because they all experience that same sense of exclusion, and they all struggle with the desire to belong. And that way they can bond, form community, and also act as a sort of like resource to one another. And then the third strategy was to educate whites in the community. And the one guy in the article mentions that he likes to approach white people because he recognizes that they're probably anxious, that they're probably uneasy, they probably are curious about him. And he says he just starts talking to them about his culture. And he's actually learned that a lot of white people don't even know where China is, right? So it's like, start there. And he sees it as a goal to educate the white people in his community, to make them comfortable with him, not have to have them ask the questions, but him just kind of offer up answers to questions he thinks they probably have as a way to build acceptance and, I think, create change within the community. The crowd most likely to participate in the alt-right are overwhelmingly white and overwhelmingly identify as men. This is what some have termed the white lash. And white lash occurs when there seems to be some sort of progress amongst racial minorities. So when we're seeing a society that's becoming more equal, more fair for marginalized populations, there's a white lash. White people will come forward and say, my America is changing, I don't like it, make America great again, and try to evolve politics and behaviors to go back to the way it was, i.e., when white privilege was greater and marginalized populations were discriminated against more thoroughly. If they try to silence the alt-right, they become targets themselves. And most corporations don't want to deal with that. They'd rather reap the profits from the alt-right. And so we have this machine that's creating social links and social networks and feeding this information and strengthening the movement unintentionally. White supremacists and the alt-right are not blind to this function of the internet and social media. In fact, they're what's called innovative opportunists. If you call them out on it and you say, hey, Pepe the Frog is racist, they can easily gaslight you and say, well, you're just being ridiculous. It's just a dumb cartoon frog. So they've figured out ways to use the internet as a tool to increase their audience, but also to grow their membership and spread their ideologies. Everything that we're seeing in the research would suggest that this was an animal to human transmission. That hasn't, however, stopped the sort of xenophobic ideologies that are perpetuating this argument that the Chinese manufactured this virus and unleashed it on the US. This, of course, completely ignores the fact that everybody on the globe has suffered from coronavirus. It's not just a US thing, but that hasn't stopped our xenophobia from really being suspicious of the Chinese, of doing this to us on purpose. I wanted to start this overview with an obvious disclaimer that I am white. And what that means in teaching about race privilege, white privilege, colorblind ideologies, white supremacy, is that more often than not, what I have to say and share with you in this module will be taken more seriously as a result of that. I want to take a moment to own that privilege and recognize that as a white instructor teaching about whiteness, that I have far greater privilege than my colleagues who are people of color trying to teach on the exact same topic. Professors of color overwhelmingly struggle to convey factual social science information about whiteness and white privilege without being assumed to be opinionated or having a chip on their shoulder. And this is a privilege that white professors like myself just don't have to deal with. In fact, if anything, in my history of teaching about race, I have been complimented on how woke I am, which, thanks. I just think that, it's the work that I have put in as a white person that I think more white people need to do. So a lot of the content of this module is going to feel very geared towards white students. And that's because this module is about awakening the awareness of what it means to be white, to try to liberate conversations around race and focus on whiteness as a racial category, which it is, and to try to help my white students deal with this position of white guilt or white fragility and see it as something that we really, as white people, need to get past. So first of all, we want to recognize colorblind privilege as a subset of meritocracy. It really allows, especially white people, to benefit from this idea that people get what they deserve. That if we deny racism exists, if we say that we're colorblind and we don't see race, then we don't have to acknowledge the role that race plays in creating inequality. And instead, we can look at the black individuals who are failing or the brown individuals who are failing and say, well, it's their own fault, right? They're getting what they deserved. Racism isn't a thing, and so therefore they must just be less than people. So it's a subset of meritocracy where whites are often, because racism doesn't exist in this mentality, right? Whites are celebrated for their individual success with the assumption that they've worked hard to achieve what they've gotten. That's really getting at that idea of, I worked hard and I'm getting what I deserve. This isn't about racial inequality, when it absolutely is. Again, acknowledging your privilege as a white person doesn't have to devalue the hard work you put in, but it definitely requires you to acknowledge that somebody of a different racial group that's marginalized would have had to have worked a lot harder to obtain the same thing you did because of that structural benefit that comes with being white. So this colorblind privilege really fails to recognize the role that white privilege plays in white people's success in society. And if you're colorblind, you believe essentially that racism has been dismantled, that we don't experience racism anymore, that we don't see color. Colorblind privilege will also bring particular token examples in as evidence that racism has ended. So they'll say things like, well, racism couldn't possibly exist because look at Oprah, she's black and she's one of the richest women in the world. Or racism is clearly over because take a look at Obama, he was a black man, therefore we have a black president, which would suggest anybody can obtain the highest position in society if they just tried hard enough. There's a couple of problems with that. One with the Obama example is calling him a black president completely denies the fact that he's half white, and raised by white grandparents who made it to the presidency. And so we're kind of dismissing even some of the white privilege that Obama has, but then to take him as a token and say, well, if he did it, anybody else can, is completely dismissing all of the barriers and hurdles that somebody like Obama or Oprah had to overcome to get where they were, and that those barriers were greater and more difficult than somebody who is white. This colorblind privilege tends to make white people feel really comfortable, and I would argue it happens in other racial groups as well, but it's particularly common amongst whites. It makes them feel like their position is well earned, that they aren't doing anything wrong, and be damned they don't see race. And we see race. I don't know why people say they don't see it. We totally do. We are not blind to race. We are socialized to categorize people based off of race in our society. The race of somebody is one of the first things you notice, that and gender. We see these symbols of identity, and they play a role in how we perceive each other and how we treat each other. And if we can't acknowledge that, then that means we also can't acknowledge the very real institutional and systemic racism in place that really limits the people of color from achieving the same thing that people who are white can achieve. It's really important that we can talk about microaggressions, that we can start to better understand where they stem from, that meta communication, and that we can begin to learn from our mistakes if we are practicing microaggressions towards marginalized populations so that this is occurring less frequently, so that people of color can have better physical and mental health, that they can feel embodied within their bodies, and that they can do better at work because they aren't constantly facing these discriminatory comments that make them feel out of place or make them feel like they don't belong, make them feel othered. Our culture is a culture of white supremacy, that sounding white is valued more than sounding black. In her study, she examined men of color and asked them about their experience with trash talking, which is code for the sort of blatant expressions of racist hate speech that her respondents experience in the online gaming world. Ortiz argues that these behaviors are evidence that we don't live in a post-racial society. The world is not colorblind. The men she interviewed argue that the anonymous, disembodied world of online gaming did not allow them to escape racism. If anything, it heightened their everyday exposure to it. White players often used racial markers such as avatars, accents, and usernames to identify men of color. Then, to gain power and control in this social environment, white men used hate speech against men of color as an expression of both masculinity and dominance. We might argue that white gamer men are motivated to behave this way for several reasons. One, because the anonymity of the internet allows them to act in ways that the real world doesn't allow. In other words, they feel safe expressing their true feelings about men of color. The other motivation is that this hate speech allows them to compensate for what they view as their own deficiencies as men. They don't live up to what sociologists refer to as hegemonic masculinity, i.e., the manliest man in society. They feel marginalized by their gamer nerd status and use overt racism as a way to feel more empowered in their marginalized masculinity status. Ortiz argues that men of color also struggle with masculinity in these online environments, but not in the same way as white men. Men of color must cope with the racism they experience online, as it evokes strong emotions within them. However, they do not feel they can express those emotions to others for fear of being labeled too emotional or mentally ill, because our culture does not commonly associate emotionality with men, especially not men of color. This inability to cope through healthy emotional channels leads to a process of desensitization. Desensitization allows men of color to continue gaming through the hate speech they experience daily. It also lacks to normalize and uphold structural racism because white men are neither called out nor sanctioned for their racist behaviors. This places men of color in a sort of double bind. If they complain about racism in online gaming, they're stigmatized for being too effeminate and emotionally weak. If they don't complain, they maintain their masculinity but must suffer in perpetuity with racism. This often leads to what Ortiz refers to as racial battle fatigue. You are an American, but to outsiders, and in particular to whites, you're Asian first, right? You aren't American. The assumption is that you're a foreigner or that you don't belong, and that there's no way you could possibly be American. You look Asian, so we'll just call you Asian American, and that will make things easier for white people, which really that's what this is about, right? That white people can't be bothered to understand the difference between different cultural ethnic identities. For example, the Japanese internment camps or Chinese immigrants on Angel Island. It's like we pride ourselves that these things aren't happening anymore in the United States, at least not with the Asian population. But what we miss is that and when I say our, I mean the dominant culture, but U.S. culture at large, when we put individuals in this sort of dilemma, when we don't allow them authenticity, we're essentially placing them in mental internment camps. Right, you're not locked up someplace and excluded from society, but your mental ability, your concept of self, your ability to express yourself, your ability to be accepted in everyday conversations and interactions is locked up. And it's locked up by the dominant culture that refuses to acknowledge that it's possible that someone who looks Asian could be authentically American, right? So if I'm, Chinese American, do I try to maintain that identity and help society to look more like a salad bowl, right? Where I'm not necessarily indoctrinated into white ideologies. I'm not necessarily fully assimilated, and that I maintain some of those cultural lineages to my parents or my grandparents or my great-grandparents' native country? Or do I embrace the push by white society to be a part of the melting pot, to shed all of that, to eradicate my otherness and become full-on American thinking, American acting? Of course, the added dilemma there, the authenticity dilemma there, is that even if somebody chose the melting pot, white society doesn't fully allow that. The white society says, okay, sure, you can try to melt with us, but you're still not going to fit in, right? You're not going to be fully embraced because you look like an other. You look like a foreigner. If you choose the melting pot, your family's upset, and whites don't accept you anyways. And if you choose the salad bowl, whites definitely aren't going to accept you because you aren't Americanized enough. So there's really a double bind, or maybe even like a triple bind in that case, that Asian Americans experience. We'll also explore our culture's beauty standards and how those tend to be lodged in whiteness, and what that means for people of color, how that might lead to an increased rate of disembodiment for those populations. White people are more likely to experience embodiment because as they move through space, how they feel is often reflected in how they're perceived and how their bodies interact with other people in social settings. Beauty standards in the US operate to make people of color, and in particular women of color, feel disembodied. That what is beautiful is not how they look. So maybe they feel beautiful inside, but their culture is telling them you're not attractive. And we do this in a multitude of ways. We do it through television, movies, magazines, advertising. The message is pretty loud and clear that the ideal beauty standard is overwhelmingly white, thin, young, able-bodied, right? This is why representation in media for people of color is really important. For one, if we can have accurate representations of what it means to be in a body that is not white, it will help to minimize stereotypes. What we often get in the media are caricatures of racial groups. So maybe it's a black person, but they're acting in ways that are very stereotypical, which is actually harmful to black people. Or we'll have individuals who are cast that are black, but they are, whitewashed. They don't act as who they are. It's almost like their person and their behaviors have to be adapted for white audience acceptance. Having a more accurate representation, having actual people acting like actual people on TV, in the movies, in advertising, in magazines, would help to minimize those stereotypes. Wearing your hair natural instead of getting it straightened. Adorning yourself in cultural linens or cultural fabrics as a way to resist white supremacy. That I don't want to alter my body and change myself to fit in and gain acceptance. And that, of course, puts the onus of responsibility on the person of color. And we want to try to broaden that and share that responsibility. So how can you also, as a person of privilege, make it so I can be more accepting of forms of resistance and see them as empowering as opposed to threatening to my own, if I'm white, right, to my own sense of whiteness and what it means to live in a white culture. Our bodies go to school, which is structured in racist ways. Our bodies go to work, which is structured in racist ways. Our bodies consume media, which is structured in racist ways. In every institution that is racist, our bodies move through that. And any single context that we go into has a particular social framing or social expectation. If I go into the system of education, it's assumed that I will write and speak like a white person, that my English will sound white. That's a social context. My body has to go there. I have to find the way to form the words to sound white. I have to use my brain to understand the white expectation and then reflect it back. White, you have the ability to shrink into the background and go unnoticed. If you're white, you have the ability to stand up and say something and be heard. We're going to look at xenophobia and how that influences anti-immigration policies here in the United States. We'll also consider how xenophobia allows individuals to believe in myths about the immigrant population here in the US, and how those mistaken beliefs might actually help to support the anti-immigration policy that we see being implemented by both Democrats and Republicans here in the United States. We'll also question this idea that the United States is a place for immigrants. We have the Statue of Liberty, which is supposed to be symbolic of arriving on the shores and seeking freedom, and yet we have policies that strictly prohibit easy navigation to the United States and easy access to citizenship. You have to consider, too, that if you're undocumented and you'd prefer a path to citizenship, you're going to be a law-abiding citizen, because if you commit crime and you're caught, you run the risk of deportation, and your path to citizenship is going to become much more difficult. So ironically, those that we fear the most in our country are the best people to have here. So we should actually be encouraging these populations to enter into the U.S. This isn't because blacks are just biologically more criminal. It's because deprivation and discrimination limit access to resources, which then encourages criminal behavior for survival. Also been a historical analysis of dangerous and criminal behavior amongst immigrant populations, and what we know from that data is that the most violent immigrants tend to come from white majority countries. And in the list of all the immigration that's happened and who is most violent, who is more likely to commit crime, it's immigrants from Ireland and Scotland. These are white dominant countries, closely linked to American value systems, and yet they come here and are more likely to commit violent crime. Again, I think we should question, why do we have anti-immigration policies, and why do we always talk about immigrants from Central and South America being the most dangerous when the data suggests otherwise? And if we're going to close our borders or try to limit immigration, maybe we should consider limiting immigration to Ireland and Scotland. As we corrupt immigrant populations, they become criminal. So there's something about U.S. society that encourages criminal behavior. And of course, as a sociologist, I'm well aware of a very strong factor, and that is the vast inequalities that we see, the inequities with gender and racism in particular. So there's something going on in U.S. culture that creates crime or makes crime predictable, and it's not immigration, and it's definitely not Latino immigrants. And in fact, we might encourage the immigration of Latinos because we know that they can act as a buffer to crime. The more first-gen Latinos we have in the United States, the lower our crime rates are going to be. Now, this is in complete opposition of our anti-immigration laws. We tend to scapegoat and practice xenophobia the most against Latino populations, and in particular, Mexican Americans. This is, by the way, when I say border, everybody's mind goes to the same place. We're not talking about the Canadian border. We're talking about the Mexican border, because we don't fear Canadians. We fear Mexicans, and we fear people from from Central and South America. If you look at the data on who is more likely to participate in crime, who is more likely to carry contraband, overwhelmingly, it's whites. It's not this simple. That sex is on a spectrum, that we have people who fall in between male and female. We usually refer to these individuals as intersexed. We have gender that should be more of a spectrum. It's not just a man or a woman, and it's also not just connected to whatever your biological sex is. There's a whole spectrum of gender identities available to us. If we fall into this rigid construction of what sex, gender, and sexuality can be, it's going to limit our ability to have diverse sexual experiences. The focus of this module, race, that the system, the gender regime, interacts with other regimes, like the system of racism in society, and creates a sort of narrow definition of what's acceptable in terms of sexual partner, romantic partner, marital partner, what's acceptable for our sexual behaviors depending on which gender we are, depending on whether or not we're from an immigrant family or not, whether we're white or a person of color, that race intersects with these categories in sometimes really problematic ways, and particularly problematic under a system of white supremacy, which we'll also explore more of in this module. If we were to ask people, poll people, what do you think the ideal man is in U.S. society, you're going to get a lot of these answers. The ideal man is white. That means that when we look at men of color, and in the case of the module, we're looking at Asian men, we automatically lump them into an other category in terms of being sexually attractive because they don't possess some of the same physical characteristics, at least that's the assumption, as what a white man would. You're also going to have people say, well, the most ideal man is going to be straight. These features are also deeply associated with what it means to be a white man, specifically. That white men are often taller, they're often have more body hair, their frames allow for more muscle mass, or they're stronger. Certainly there's a lot of competitiveness that's encouraged amongst white boys growing up, and certainly in fields like business, where white men really dominate, that competitiveness is undeniable. These aren't accidents that the ideals align with what it also means to be a white man in society. That becomes really important when we start looking at racial minorities and how they present masculinity in a culture that will automatically put them in a hierarchy, lower on the hierarchy, simply because they can't live up to what's considered the white ideal. It makes sense to us cognitively that if you have a man and everything that's opposite is what makes a woman, that the two together are complete, right? That you have like a whole person when a man and a woman get together. So if that's been ingrained in us, we've learned that, we've been socialized into that. If I'm a straight woman and I express femininity, or I uphold what it means to be a woman, and I view Asian men as being feminine, that is an automatic no. Because I'm supposed to be attracted to masculine men. And if you're hairless or short-statured or smaller body frame, I'm going to associate you with femininity. Asian men are often considered at the lower rungs of the hierarchy. Most desirable is white men, and Asian men tend to be at or near the bottom. And it's not fair, right? Because Asian men desire sex and love equally as any other racial group, but they're not valued, which means they're going to have a harder time finding a partner, right? Somebody who will be willing to see them as a sexual being. So like this Asian guy in the picture here, get buff, right? Get lean, look strong, try to manipulate your body and your physical features to align with what it means to be a white man in society. The value of masculinity from Chinese culture. So things like being intellectual, of valuing intelligence and education, of being moral, of being just a good person, somebody who's honest, family-oriented. How can we shift the culture or shift the narrative to make it so hegemonic masculinity is aligned with also being intelligent and moral and family-oriented? The other option for challenging the ideal is to take Asian men as they are and sexualize them. Just average, normal Asian men, and write them into TV shows and movies, into music, in a way that sexualizes them as perfectly normal human beings. We have opportunities to just take Asian men and sexualize them. If I am the good girl and I abide by the cultural expectations of what it means to be a Filipino, then I am not going to be accepted by whites in society or by American culture. So they're left with this choice of, do I be a good girl and be excluded from white society, or do I be a bad girl and be accepted by white society but excluded from my Filipino community? And this we tend to associate Asian women with being an object for, in particular, white men's fantasy. Not surprising, because we associate Asian women with sex work, we also have a history in the US of associating Asian women as vectors of disease. White men have been, what's the right word to use? They have felt harmed or jilted by the feminist movement, and many white men find white women to be too independent, too anti-establishment, too willing to break the gender expectations, and they actually crave this more patriarchal dynamic between themselves and their future wife or their girlfriend. This is, of course, assuming heterosexuality. And this makes Asian women really desirable because they're stereotyped as being the more ideal woman, that they're more passive, that they will serve their husband, they'll treat him like a king, they'll do what he says and align with him, wait on him, clean his house, take care of his children. And that makes Asian women desirable because deep down inside, that's what white men still want from white women, but can't get it because white women have been liberated. Institution of higher education can have normative expectations that reflect white supremacy or reflect like what it means to be an ideal white person, and in particular an ideal white man, and how Black men, for example, can struggle to overcome the stereotypes that are held about them and abide by this higher education normative expectation for professional behavior and appropriate behavior. But we also know that historically the standardized tests have assumed, and this is why it's considered implicit bias, it's assumed that the student who's taking the test is white, or that they'll have like a white framework or a white understanding of the world when they take the exam. These can be really simple things that don't seem like they would have a huge effect, but we know from the research in sociology that they do. Things like only using white-sounding names on the test so that students of color can't see themselves in the questions or see themselves in the scenarios that are presented. It could also be the sorts of questions that get asked. So are they asked about things that are historically a part of white culture? And even if it's not a question specifically about white culture, it could be a story problem or some sort of vignette that it's going to feel like an outside experience coming from a person of color. It's not surprising that these tests often have that framework or that assumption, because the people who create this content are often white and they aren't able to see outside of their own framework or perspective to be more inclusive. How do students in Cupertino District shift racial ideologies away from the kind of mainstream white supremacy that we've seen in the history of the United States and the system of education? And your reading doesn't refer to it as this, but this is what I'm referring to it as, is the Cupertino effect. So the question becomes, what is happening in Cupertino that would make it so white supremacy doesn't seem to be the main ideology around educational outcomes? So what we see in Cupertino, which is unlike most places in the United States, is that there has been a huge recent increase in immigrants, namely from India and the wealthier parts of East Asia. One of the reasons we've seen such a huge increase in immigration is because of the tech industries in Silicon Valley, but also because those cultures, those ethnic groups, those nationalities tend to have very high standards and expectations around education, and they're drawn specifically to the Cupertino School District because the Cupertino School District is known for its academic excellence. This isn't an accident. This isn't unintentional. These immigrants have decided that Cupertino is where they want to end up because they want their kids to go to a quality school. We have also seen, with this increase in immigrants in the Cupertino School District, we have seen an exodus of white families and white students. So what historically would have been a white-dominated community has now become a minority white community. In fact, the Cupertino School District is comprised of about 29% white students. Everybody else is what we would consider on a national scale a racial minority group, overwhelmingly Asian students. Now, Cupertino School District has shifted how American culture views academic success. If you were to take the white perspective, i.e. the American perspective on what education is all about, academics is important, but so is athletics. In fact, if you move towards the center of the country and you're looking anywhere in the Midwest, or I would say the Deep South, if you are doing well in school and you aren't playing a sport, you aren't deemed like a top-tier student. You have to do it all. You have to play sports, usually a sport per season, plus do really well in your academics. Cupertino is slightly different. Sports aren't required, sports aren't encouraged, and in some cases, sport is deemed as a distraction from academics. It's not something that's going to get you places. It's not something that's going to make you more money in your future. And we see where sports are not popularized in Cupertino School District. Instead, the focus is solely on academics and intense academics. Not just doing well, not just having a high GPA, but taking lots of AP classes, being in honors classes, trying to get in the top 10 of your school. In Cupertino, they have successfully restructured the American race hierarchy. Whereas pretty much everywhere else in the country and in pretty much every single institution that you come across, we have white supremacy. We have this idea that whites are the most successful, that whites are the best performers, they're the most honest, the most hardworking, the most educated. And we see in Cupertino where that's been flipped. In fact, whiteness is being associated with being less intelligent. If you leave Cupertino, you're right back to the normal status quo where whites are valued higher. But this does reflect how changes in populations can affect race politics or race ideologies. That where whites are the minority, it shouldn't be surprising that they're not going to necessarily hold the highest status. Now, most places in the United States, whites are not the minority, and so white supremacy is going to reign supreme. But in some places like Cupertino School District, we actually see where whites are being negatively stereotyped and therefore experiencing the sort of stereotype threat that historically has been applied to students of color. Women of color, and in particular single women of color with children who are also poor, that they aren't really motivated to complete their degree and that's why they're not in college, or that if they are in college, they're doing it to take advantage of social welfare programs. We know from the social science data that both of those statements are false. These women are highly motivated despite the barriers. They are incredibly persistent and do succeed, but not with ease because the structure of education does not provide them easy, gentle pathways to obtaining those degrees. So they are highly motivated. They're not trying to take advantage of the system. They are struggling in an institution that was not built for them. And we need to change that if we care about this vulnerable population. The expression of anger is socially acceptable for men, but not specifically for Black men. That intersection makes it different for Black men than it does for white men. And when it comes to anger, across both gender and race lines, it's usually the position with the higher status that is allowed to express anger. So if you're a man, you're more likely to be able to express anger than if you're a woman. And if you're white, you're more likely to be able to express anger than if you're a person of color. Because we practice white supremacy in terms of the racial dynamic, and we practice patriarchy in terms of the gender dynamic. If it's okay for you to express anger, then you don't have to evoke, constrain, or perform. You don't have to participate in emotional labor because it's socially acceptable. If you're a Black man, for example, and you are allowed to show anger because you're a man, but you aren't allowed to show anger because you're Black, then you're going to have to do that emotional labor to stifle that, to hide that expression. And we also know from the research that the person who is of lower status is more likely to receive anger from others. If you are a woman, you're more likely to have a man be angry at you. If you are a person of color, you are more likely to experience white people getting angry at you and it being socially acceptable. It's allowed. Mainstream society, white society says that Black men are killing each other, they're attacking each other, they're a threat to one another. You see this rhetoric a lot in right-wing politics, conservative politics, Republican politics, around things like gun law and racism. It's always like, well, whites aren't racist against blacks, blacks are killing each other, and cops aren't killing black people are killing black people. You hear this rhetoric a lot. And so these Black men at the university said, well, we want to overcome that. We want to overcome those stereotypes by forming a brotherhood where we always are cordial with each other when we're front stage, that we always support one another, that we're always jovial with one another, that we act as brothers on the front stage so that we can challenge those stereotypes that white people have about us, that Black brothers are killing each other, right? They're violent and angry at each other. That if we could dismantle white supremacy, there wouldn't be a need for this sort of performance and this sort of emotional labor, because it would just be okay to be an angry Black man and not have it mean anything more than that. All the microaggressions and the sort of coping strategies that people of color use to overcome those microaggressions can really lead to what's called the process of weathering. That having your body be in this constant state of stress can lead to higher rates of vulnerability for negative health outcomes. So you're more likely, for example, to experience chronic illness, things like diabetes, hypertension, heart disease, cancer, mental health crises. These are normal across all racial populations, but that we see with people of color, and in particular blacks, that they have an earlier onset of these chronic illnesses. And the argument in the data, in the social sciences, as well as in public health, is that that early onset is a direct reflection of that weathering process. Overwhelmingly, black and brown people age faster, meaning the ways that our bodies respond to aging are heightened or accelerated in people of color versus whites. And they're more likely to believe white patients because of those associations we have with white people in society, that we don't have things like being moral and honest and good people. We don't have those same associations with people of color. The doctor is less likely to take action or prescribe some sort of solution or treatment to a patient who is a racial minority.